Good day from Glasgow, Scotland. I'm Gregor Robertson. I'm the Global Ambassador for the Global Covenant of Mayors, and we are thrilled to be together here, some of us live here from Glasgow and some live virtually from their communities around the world. We're here to talk about the City Climate Finance Gap Fund, and the Gap Fund that has been an extraordinary new entry into the climate finance and support for cities who need it the most arena. We are seeing this gap fund helping cities around the world, particularly in the global south, to advance their climate plans into action and get projects moving. So we are going to have a robust conversation today, starting here from Glasgow live, and then moving to a panel that we have joining us virtually, who I will introduce in a moment. For now, we're going to start things off with our two live guests here in Glasgow. And first, I'll introduce Ms. Carol Dieschborg, who is the Minister of Environment, Climate and Sustainable Development in Luxembourg. Luxembourg was a very generous contributor to get the GAP Fund started out of the gate in partnership with the World Bank and EIB, European Investment Bank, and Global Covenant of Mayors. The government of Luxembourg was a leader in helping us get things started to support our cities, and I wanted to give the minister an opportunity to tell us why Luxembourg has chosen to take this leadership position, and how you feel about the GAP Fund and its early start out of the gate.
Okay, thank you, Gregor, and it's a pleasure to be with you at this second event here in Glasgow, because last Friday already there was an event, and first of all I would like to thank the organizer and express my sincere gratitude for this event, because we cannot do climate change, fight climate change without having cities, having local authorities, without having people on board. So that for me, so speaking here from Glasgow, what is at stake? I think people are watching to Glasgow in order to see us as politicians get us on the 1.5 degree path. They want us to get a result on mitigation efforts. So we all have to step up the action. And this is only possible with concrete projects on the ground and in the idea of partnership and cooperation. So we need to step up on party side, our NDCs, and we need to ensure that there's enough finance, both on private but also on the public side, and that we're going in the same direction in order to fulfill what we all agreed in Paris. It's not just doing business as usual, it's a deep transformation of everything, and there we need local authorities, and there we need partnership. As far as concrete implementation is concerned, let me stress, therefore, the importance of partnership between public and private sector and all relevant stakeholders. I think this is really crucial. So the GAP Fund that we are talking about is the best example for this good collaboration, because you told us already, there are donors, in this case Luxembourg and Germany, there are the banks, World Bank, European Investment Bank, and this is a partnership with the German International Cooperation Agency, the Global Covenant of Mayors, Local Governments for Sustainability, C40 Cities, and City Climate Finance Leadership Alliance. So it's really a strong cooperation and partnership. And coming from a country where we offer a lot of things to do, we have a climate pact, and every single local community is engaging for their own strategies. We have a nature pact to develop local strategy on nature protection. So coming together in order to scale up and work for concrete urban projects will not only bring the change at the local level and more well-being, because that's what it's about, having safer cities, having cities where we can live in, and even in the warm summer, for instance, find some trees, a shadow, have the right infrastructure, building up resilience, and we will thus help to step up the efforts of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because 70% are produced in the cities. Indeed, half of the population lives in cities, and this figure rises to 70% by 2050. So it's of utmost importance to have cities in. So Luxembourg's new international climate finance strategies, what we agreed on in the government in this summer, targets high-impact climate and environmental projects while seeking new models of financing, including the mobilization of private funds. So for us, it's important in this strategy, we embedded as well to have mitigation and adaptation in a balance, but we also stressed the mainstreaming issue of gender, human rights, and we really said that we won't not only tackle climate protection, but also biodiversity loss, and we will do this together with the local level, because it's a bottom-up that we need beneath the framework that we are designing as politicians here in Glasgow. The Luxembourg government will ensure that it supports cities and administration that often lack the capacity and funding to prepare projects from an early stage to a stage where they're picked up by potential investors. Because we all know about the difficulty to set up a project and that there's a real bottleneck for key urban climate finance projects, and this is exactly where this GAP fund comes in. The GAP fund is providing a facility for early stage project support to cities in order to turn ideas based on your own climate action plans into robust project business cases. We have already seen, and I think it was in the introductory video, some concrete projects on the way despite this COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm sure that this is just the beginning. So we want to scale up, and we're happy to have you all on board. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. And yeah, as we saw in the opening video, 33 cities and projects are now underway, which is quite remarkable. And as you say, during a time of a global pandemic and a whole new program that's starting out. But again, thank you for your remarks and for your support from the Luxembourg government, along with the German government, who were the first to invest in the City Climate Action GAP Fund. So next, we're going to hear, we have the honor of having Jen Jones with us, and she is the Chief of Staff to the Secretary of the U.S. Secretary of, the Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, yes. I think in the U.S. You're the Chief of Staff to Marcia Fudge, who's the Secretary. We're honored to have you here, and love to have some introductory comments from you about the GAP Fund and the work that it's doing in the world.
Thanks so much, Gregor, and thank all of you for inviting HUD to be a part of this panel. Again, I'm Jen Jones, Chief of Staff at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. I'm happy to be here on behalf of HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge. What I love about this conversation and sort of allowing HUD to be a part of a conversation on the world stage is that a significant portion of HUD's resources are dedicated to investing in cities. Not just the bricks and mortar that you would expect from a federal housing agency, but the resources that promote planning, that promote innovation, and promote building capacity. You know, from HUD's program called the Community Development Block Grant Program, we have a program called Choice Neighborhoods, a Section 108 loan program, all different programs serving different needs, but the one thing that they have all in common is that it is designed to provide the money that is the hardest to get. And that's funding for TA, capacity building, that incentivizes planning, cross-sector collaboration, and public engagement to help cities solve really big problems, right? So, you know, at HUD, we have long known that cities are on the front lines of the climate crisis, right? And they are the ones that hold the keys for building an equitable and resilient future. Cities have been and will continue to be increasingly impacted by climate change. Challenges such as heat stress and flooding and sea level rise, in addition to challenges related to population growth, migration, aging infrastructure, and the lack of affordable housing. And the most vulnerable among us, which is who HUD serves, are the poor and primarily people of color. They are the ones more likely to suffer from the results of climate change, right? So for too long and in too many places, people of color have been forced to live in the least desirable areas, near landfills and toxic waste facilities and in flood zones, leaving us exposed to the worst that climate change has to offer. President Joe Biden is calling on every part of the American government to help shape our nation's response to the climate crisis. That includes engaging with our cities, who often serve as incubators, innovation hubs, helping us, the federal government, tackle the climate crisis and the inequities it exacerbates. Thankfully, our cities are leading the way by creating bold new solutions to tackle climate change. They're building community resilience and addressing long-standing injustices. Cities like Birmingham, Alabama. In 2011, a tornado leveled much of Pratt City. It's a suburb of Birmingham, predominantly African American. It displaced more than 1,000 residents. Pratt used HUD's Community Development Block Grant Program to invest in a new library with storm strength glass, 4 neighborhood storm shelters, a 6-acre park, and new housing construction, mostly for seniors. HUD, in partnership with a broad coalition of city leaders, helped transform Pratt City. Another example, Minot, North Dakota, experienced a devastating flood in 2011, caused the evacuation of 1/4 of the town's population, right? So in the wake of that flood, local leaders used HUD funding to help people of modest means purchase single-family homes in neighborhoods outside of the flood zone, right? So leaders throughout our nation are using HUD's resources to invest in projects that help vulnerable communities to build resilience in climate change, further fair housing, and make neighborhoods safer and more desirable places to live. Moving forward, our work together will be more important than ever before. Our climate crisis demands that every nation and every community take swift, intentional, and decisive action. I am overjoyed to be here today to hear more about the work of the City Climate Finance Gap Fund and to learn more about what you're doing to bring that back to the states. So thank you so much for allowing me to be here.
And thank you very much for your opening comments. Great context from the U.S. And really an example of how in the global north, countries do have existing programs and support that can go from our national governments right to the ground in cities particularly when there are major impacts, but also for helping plan and engage the people on the ground as they plan and build their communities, climate resilient communities. So great to have an illustration of how you're doing it at HUD in the US. We're really going to shift gears now with a panel discussion. We have a panel here virtually joining us to really drill down on what the Gap Fund is doing around the world. In many cases in countries unlike Luxembourg and the US or in Canada, where I'm from, where we have more support, more programs available, we're dealing with many countries that don't have that support for local communities and cities that are facing the brunt of climate impacts and really don't have the capacity to gear up and to get infrastructure even started, which is what the City Climate Finance Gap Fund is all about. So let me thank both of you again for being here live from Glasgow and welcome the panel that we have joining us here today. And I'll just introduce all the panelists before I go to our first speaker. We have Mr. Werner Schmidt, who is the Director, Urban and Territorial Development for the European Investment Bank, one of our key banking partners. We have Mr. Same Waba, who's the Director, Urban Resilience and Land Global Practice for the World Bank, the other big bank that's been helping grow the Gap Fund on the ground. We have Ms. Carolina Urrutia, who is the Secretary of Environment of Bogota, Colombia. Welcome to you. And Mr. Sveto Malongo, who's the Deputy Municipal Manager of Mbombela, South Africa. Honored to have the four of you joining us here as the panel and speaking to your experience and leadership, frankly, in getting the Gap Fund going and getting projects going using that gap fund, those project funds. So we'll start, Mr. Werner Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt, if you would, obviously you saw the opportunity with the introduction of the gap fund. Can you explain from a European Investment Bank perspective why this was compelling and why the EIB has stepped up into leadership to make this a real priority?
Thank you so much for first of all, for inviting me to this thrilling panel. And it's obviously a pleasure to address this panel now from Luxembourg as well. Good afternoon to everyone. Now, for the EIB, the European Investment Bank, as the EU Climate Bank, climate is a key priority. And in this context, I would like to just outline a little bit why the Climate City Finance Gap Fund is a unique opportunity also for us to provide and to help cities in the global south on climate-related issues. As you know, and we heard already, the Climate City Finance Gap Fund, the original concept was developed by the German Federal Ministry of Environment and the Global Covenant of Mayors. It's, as the minister has outlined, it really demonstrates a unique collaborative model which combines funding from Germany, Luxembourg, and is co-implemented by the World Bank, by our colleagues in Washington, D.C., the European Investment Bank in partnership with GIZ, and we are working directly with a number of city groups. So it's linking together a number of areas. Now, the background for the establishment of the GAP Fund, and that's pretty important also for the EIB, is that clearly cities often struggle to develop climate-friendly and resilient infrastructure in the developing world. And they are also frequently lacking the skills and the finance, the support needed in the early stages of project preparation. So well-prepared projects actually have a better chance of attracting funding and also therefore are important then for the EIB. So it can contribute to local development, the climate goals and the green recovery. So in this context, actually the GAP Fund as such and our involvement in the GAP Fund is clearly important in as much as getting early stage technical assistance for urban development plans done. In this context, the mission of the GAP Fund to work to closing the financing gap for early stage climate planning and project preparation is clearly very appealing to the EIB. Now, significantly and importantly, the technical assistance for upstream and early stage project preparation, this goes from strategy development, project concept definition, but also to the pre-feasibility stage. So in this context, actually, we can thereby provide a pipeline of new opportunities, operations, which ultimately can then hopefully be financed, because we have seen through the development of the work we've done in the GAP Fund that in particular the early stages is missing. What has to be said that the GAP Fund as such doesn't finance project implementation, but clearly proposals that are approved for GAP Fund support would and could benefit from facilitation for other opportunities from the World Bank, from the EIB, GIZ, and other project preparation financing facilities. Let me just add one additional point on who could address the GAP Fund and who could apply to the GAP Fund. Clearly, we address cities. We address multi-municipal authorities, local governments of developing and emerging countries, which are ODA eligible. And they all can apply for the GAP Fund. When a city is not a direct applicant, evidence of support from the local government and expression of interest related will be requested. Now, I would, in this context, summarize our really keen interest and our support and our activity in the GAP Fund clearly as from the mission of the European Investment Bank, becoming the EU Climate Bank, the Climate City GAP Fund is really something which is clearly fully aligned with our mission and has proven, as we have seen already in the short trailer, some very positive results initially. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schmidt, for that great overview of the GAP Fund. Good to have that EIB perspective on it as well. And we're now going to go to Mr. Waba at the World Bank. And we saw the introductory video. We recently marked the first year of GAP Fund activity. What progress would you say the GAP Fund has made to date? If you were to speak to the highlights from a World Bank perspective, how are we doing so far?
Thanks for the opportunity to discuss the City Climate Finance Gap Fund, which for us really is a perfect example of how a wide range of stakeholders can really come together to address the challenge of our lifetime. Now, we know that cities are at the forefront of the climate transition and that we need to do much more if we are to reach the Paris Agreement goals. And this is because, cities are responsible for 70% of greenhouse gas emissions, even though they house only 55% of the population. And we expect them to be housing 70% of humanity by 2050. With that delta happening mainly in Africa and in Asia. So ultimately, the way cities are built and managed will determine the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions and climate vulnerability. But also because cities, are the place where 80% of global GDP is generated, the impact of extreme weather events can be staggering on cities. They paralyze infrastructure, affect livelihoods, and pose existential threats to coastal cities. So it's truly heartening that we're seeing cities, are so motivated to act. We have more than 6,000 cities that have developed climate action plans, and with that, the climate ambitions of cities are becoming a significant part of the solution. But we also know that we need more, because the cities that have developed the climate action plans barely represent a fifth of the global urban population. So we need more cities to commit, and we need the ambitions to translate into action and impact on the ground, both emission reductions and, of course, increased resilience. And that's why the GAP Fund is really very important, because it focuses on this critical early stage support where the ambitions need to be turned into projects that are ready to be financed and implemented. And we know that the demand is clearly there. So the GAP Fund has been operated for a little over a year, has already received 160 expressions of interest submitted by cities all over the world. And we are working hand in hand at the World Bank together with the EIB to screen and select the proposals that show the highest potential climate impact. So I'm excited to report that 1 year after being launched, the fund is already supporting more than 35 cities around the world, ranging from the upstream climate analytics to the early stage project preparation and pre-feasibility. And going forward, the fund is targeting to support at least 180 cities. Now, in addition, the fund has also been supporting cutting-edge global knowledge, technical notes, and knowledge sharing. One of those pieces was the contribution that we provided on enabling frameworks to mobilize urban climate finance. That's part of the CCFLA State of the Cities Climate Finance Report of 2021, and then very specific technical notes on urban greenhouse gas modeling tools, a primer on urban form and emissions, etc. Now, to your question on how does it really operate in practice, and building on what Werner has presented, we really have an amazing collaborative model. So this is one initiative. It's organized around 2 multi-donor trust funds, one that the EIB manages, the other that the World Bank manages. We coordinate on a day-to-day basis, and we do our joint outreach and communication together. And we have one GAP Fund website that cities submit the application to, and we work in the back office, to meet regularly to screen the EOIs. We have a partnership forum that's ensuring coordination and tapping on the resources of all the partners, the donors, the implementing agencies, the city networks, the global initiatives. And we have a very strong link with the city networks and global initiatives like the Global Covenant of Mayors, C40, ICLEI, and CCFLA to ensure that the GAP Fund remains demand-driven and focusing on answering the most pressing challenges that cities need. So I'd like really to take the opportunity to thank the 2 governments that believed in this idea, that helped start this idea, the government of Germany, the government of Luxembourg, because with their support and their leadership on this agenda, we are able to jumpstart the support and really go to scale. And of course, to continue going to scale, we would like to encourage other partners to join, because 1 year into operation, the GAP Fund has clearly demonstrated that it is relevant, that it's fit for purpose, and we should definitely aim to scale up the critical support it should provide to cities, like the minister said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Waba. And speaking of cities, we're going to shift gears now and speak with our two representatives from great cities around the world. And first to Ms. Urrutia in Bogota, Colombia. Bogota has a history of being a leader on sustainability and really empowering its citizens to be more resilient, making the city more livable. I might not think as a mayor historically, I think Bogota, what is Bogota applying for the GAP Fund for? What is the fit there? I'm really curious to hear how this appealed to Bogota and what in Bogota's case was the need in terms of utilizing the GAP Fund. If you could give us some background, that would be great.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm here replacing my mayor, Claudia Lopez. I got back from Glasgow a couple of days ago, so I'm kind of jealous that some of you are still there. So Bogota, as you mentioned, is well known for being innovative in terms of sustainability, particularly as it relates to transport. But there are a few areas that we've seen the GAP Fund as a huge opportunity. As all cities, Bogota has a huge responsibility in terms of moving forward with its climate agenda. And in Colombia, a country that catastrophically still faces huge obstacles in terms of deforestation, there's not a lot of funds coming in from the national government. They are focused on forest and biodiversity loss due to our high rates of deforestation, and that is how it should be. The national government is focusing on that issue, and financing for city governments is not coming in as hot as we'd like. And there's two issues that we're working on that are very important for the city and that are aligned with our new climate action plan and with the proposal that we're putting forth in our land use master plan, which is going through our city council right now. The first one that we've applied for financing from the GAP Fund is our low carbon vital neighborhoods. So what we're trying to do is reduce automobile dependency and emissions generated by motorized transport by redesigning and doing strategic interventions at the neighborhood level, at the smallest scale in the city. So we're reprioritizing and redistributing public space in order to prioritize, of course, the people that walk in our city and our bicycle users, and of course, clean mass transport and reducing space for cars and fossil fuels in general. But we're also encouraging the relocation of housing, commercial retail, and cultural land uses so that citizens can tend to most of their needs within 15 to 30 minutes from their work. This is our sort of strategic, what do you call it? There's a good word for this that I'm forgetting. Well, strategic local interventions at the neighborhood level to work on the 15-minute city, which in Bogota, we're an 8.5 million city. We need to really focus at the local level and maybe not get to the 15-minute, but perhaps to the 30-minute city. So low carbon, vital neighborhoods is a strategy that needs funding and also strategic thinking from the global level. And that's why the GAP Fund is so attractive to us for that one. And the second one is from us, from the Secretariat of the Environment. And it is an initiative to have as many urban forests across the city as we can. We've allowed both in our land use plan and in our development plan for the idea to use space that isn't adequately used in the city and take advantage of it to face two issues: the deficit of green public areas in our city and the threat of heat islands that are in what we've studied from the city. Some neighborhoods can have increased temperatures from almost 3 degrees already with the impact of climate change that we have. Between now and 2040, we have at least 15 neighborhoods in the city whose temperature could go up by almost 3 degrees. So we're prioritizing urban forests as a means not only to face heat islands, but also as one of the capital of one of the most biodiverse countries in the world, as a means to reprioritize urban biodiversity and urban greening, as well as improving our temperature and improving people's quality of life. I don't have to teach all of you about the huge advantages of having high quality green public spaces across the city, particularly in those areas that have large deficits. We are a city that was, 50% of our city was developed informally, as many of the global South cities have developed. So planning for parks, for forests, for natural areas has really not been very effective. And quality of life, violence, mental health can all be improved through the implementation of urban forests. So these two specific issues that really address climate change at the local level, thinking not only of emissions, of mitigation and adaptation, but also of those points where quality of life and climate justice meet in the urban space. And the GAP Fund is really very attractive to us, both of course for the financing, but also due to experience like this one, meeting other cities, sharing our knowledge and sharing the knowledge that institutions such as both banks present here can share with us, so we can have increased effectiveness on the ground.
Thank you, Ms. Urrutia, and appreciate hearing the two different examples from Bogota where the GAP Fund can be useful. And I'm curious now in shifting to South Africa, and Mr. Malongo, if we'd love to hear from you in terms of what your challenges are with the climate crisis impacting your community, and what the GAP Fund has been helpful for Mbombela in South Africa.
Thank you so much, Program Director. Good evening to all our panelists and all those that are connected. We really want to appreciate the invite for us to share what we're doing in terms of response to climate change as a city. We are a capital city of one of the provinces. South Africa's got 9 provinces, and one of the provinces on the eastern side of the country, and we're the capital city of that particular province. We are on the eastern side, bordering Mozambique and Swaziland. Indeed, as a city, we are not immune to climate change effect and vulnerability. We a summer rainfall area right now, as I'm speaking to you, it's our rainfall season, and we have already started experiencing a lot of flooding and some disasters that are happening that we're responding to on a daily basis. So we are really grateful and to the donors and all the different countries that have decided on creating this particular fund. We believe that this GAP Fund, climate change fund, is going to assist us a long way. As a city, we have already developed the city's climate response strategy and implementation plan, which was approved by council some few years back. However, we have not yet been that much successful in terms of ensuring that we get the plan, the strategy to be implemented. So as and when the opportunity availed itself, we took that with both hands and made our submissions. And as I've indicated, we are grateful that we are one of the cities that were beneficiaries or that have been approved to be supported by this GAP Fund. One of there are a number of projects that we have identified, or initiatives that will ensure that as a city we are able to mitigate and we ensure that as a city, we are also building community resilience to make sure that we are mainly rural in a sense. 70% of our population are residing in rural areas. Only 30% that is more urban. So, and we're a low-income country, as we are well aware of, and there are a lot of competing needs as a city in terms of basic service provision to our city. So, when we realized and we saw this opportunity of the GAP Fund, we took it with both hands to make sure that because we're not immune and we are really affected on a daily basis, and we're spending a lot of money. Because even if you're not proactive in terms of ensuring that we've got plans to respond to climate change, when it hits you, you have to respond as a city from a disaster management point of view. So we felt that it's better for us to make sure that we engage our communities in whatever strategies that we are coming up with, so that we also not ignore the indigenous knowledge that is there to our communities. And as it's projected, I mean, as a city, the projection is such that the temperatures are going to continue to rise as we go into the future years. So one of our main projects that we have identified that we submitted for support is the planning for around the issue of stormwater management. Because as a city, we're coming from our own past, where in the designs of our stormwater drainage system are such that it's just to release the water, the runoff as we get the rain. It's just to quickly release, and there's no retention in terms of, or retention ponds for that matter, to make sure that the water it's sort of like retained, it's released gradually, so that it's not that destructive because of the intensity and the velocity of the water. So downstream, the destructive nature of this runoff from our stormwater drainage system are such that are resulting in a devastating effect to our communities, because we have a number of communities that are also residing in floodplains and floodlines. So when this water is channeled through a drainage system that channels the water such that increases the velocity of the water, it therefore becomes very destructive to our communities downstream. And it also enlarges the river banks as well. So it's damaging to our environment. So this is one project that we felt is very much critical, because as a city, as you will know, that is more of concrete slabs and cement. So all the water are channeled through to the drainage system. And if the drainage system, our stormwater drainage system, are not such that they are able to retain the water and release it gradually, so that it reduces the velocity and the impact and the destruction of that water downstream. So this is one of the projects. So we are grateful to be part of the participant. One of the cities that is being considered. We are developing a city, low-income city, and as I've indicated, and we are characterized by triple challenges of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. So even to generate our own revenue as a city, we've developed this city response, the climate response plan strategy, but we are a bit struggling with ensuring that we put that plan into action, in ensuring that it really assists us in ensuring that we develop this resilient, community resilient, and we're able to mitigate and are adapting to climate change. There's not much that we can do. We just have to adapt and mitigate and make sure that our community are such that are resilient to some of the effects of this devastating phenomenon of climate change. Yeah, in short, that's brief. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you very much for filling us in on both the challenges that you're facing and then the compelling project that you put forward, which was awarded funding through the GAP Fund. So a great story of how you're adapting your city to the challenges and climate impacts and being able to utilize the GAP Fund to accelerate that process. I'd love to hear, why don't we do one more shorter round of questions and answers to drill down a little more on the GAP Fund, and maybe back to you, Mr. Schmidt. maybe a few more projects, if you could illustrate a few more different projects that have been receiving support, some more examples for those cities that are out there watching and considering applying for support. If you could share a few more examples from other cities that you've seen come before the GAP Fund.
Absolutely, with great pleasure, actually. And but unfortunately, I will not have such a lively testimony as the colleague just before. But obviously, as I outlined initially, we are providing early stage funding and project assistance to cities. So clearly, the proposals as such must have a clear focus, but they can actually include many urban sectors. So nature-based solution, green areas, urban mobility. We heard it from Bogota on bicycle passes, energy efficiency, very wide range of different sectors. Now, to give you a few examples, actually, we heard obviously now South Africa, but some parts which the EIB and GIZ have already looked at is also a project in Chefchaouen in Morocco, where we did a waste characterization study and the development of a specific waste management concept to focus on the treatment and valorization of the different waste streams. So very much oriented towards the circular economy. We have another project in Ukraine, in Vinnytsia, where we're supporting in the analysis of the potential to integrate climate change adaptation measures around the southern Bug River, such as new green spaces along the embankments and walking routes around Costa City. So again, something where we are looking at the inner city water system. When we're going to South America, in Campinas and in Rio de Janeiro, we are supporting the analysis of nature-based solutions, all again along the river, to foster climate change adaptation and reduce flood risks. We are working for instance, in Côte d'Ivoire, in Danané, to support a preliminary analysis on the deployment of a fleet of 600 low-carbon, low-cost solar tricycle taxis to meet the city's most pressing mobility needs for people and obviously also for cargo. And one last example, Podgorica in Montenegro, where we are looking at the pre-feasibility analysis to develop a pilot of green roofs, facades on public buildings and to increase the permeability of public space surfaces. You see a wealth of different project types in different locations. And this brings me to one final point here with regard to the geographic scope of the GAP Fund. Clearly, this is a global fund supporting cities in developing countries in all ODA eligible regions. There are no fixed allocations of support per target region, obviously, but we have to ensure a certain regional diversification. And obviously, if we receive a number of EOIs, expression of interests from the same city, the GAP Fund will contact the applicants and seek to prioritize and coordinate the different proposals. I hope this clarifies, and thank you so much for the question. Thanks, Gregor. Over to you.
Yeah, very helpful. Thanks for the examples and also some clarity around that process as different cities bring forward maybe a few different ideas, as Bogota has done. That prioritization is obviously key. And back to Mr. Waba, you made comments earlier about calling on national governments to contribute. We had Germany and Luxembourg as the initial funders of this. When I've learned of the GAP Fund in my capacity with the Global Covenant of Mayors, I thought it was a brilliant idea and an excellent way as a mayor, an excellent way for national governments to get support on the ground to communities, cities around the world that need it the most. And we hear this over and over about the climate finance is not moving. The wealthy nations have committed the funding, they're not moving the funding. There's a shortfall, and we see the impacts in cities around the world. Every day we hear the devastating stories of impacts from climate, floods and fires and heat waves, sea level rise, whether it's an immediate impact or it's just that steady erosion that is pulling cities apart. Could you speak to maybe from a World Bank perspective, do you think we have a good opportunity here to get more countries to commit to the GAP Fund, to really scale this up? When I think about it, it should be 10 times or 100 times, so we keep EIB and World Bank busy, very busy in getting support out to all of these cities, because the need is so great. What is slowing our progress? What do we need to do to accelerate this fund and get more nations contributing?
Thanks. This is an excellent question. I think the premise of the GAP Fund itself, which is covering this particularly perceptible gap between the very upstream, the idea that's out there, and the downstream implementation and access to finance, is really critical. So the GAP Fund itself is becoming a very important catalyst to unleashing basically a much larger volume of finance. So the departure point is, the challenge is not a lack of access to finance. It's a lack of an investment, a pipeline of investments that could become ready to be financed. Hence the three, if you will, main objectives in which the GAP Fund is providing support, which is the technical assistance and the capacity building to ensure that we have a low carbon resilient urbanization. The second being this building of a high quality urban investment pipeline for later stage technical assistance, and then sharing the knowledge on project preparation with developers and financiers. This articulation is particularly critical, and that's why I think if other countries come in and help scale up the GAP Fund, they will help unleash a significant amount of investment, because the GAP Fund itself is prefaced on a leverage ratio of 1:40, meaning $1 invested in the GAP Fund is meant to unleash $40 of investments out there in terms of helping advance a project towards financing, and then it can mobilize the financing. So if you take examples of some of the cities that we're working with, in first, those that we're working with upstream. So cities that need to build their greenhouse gas inventories and to identify what climate actions and interventions they should take. So these are pilots we have in cities like Fez in Morocco, or cities of Vinh and Ha Tinh in Vietnam, and Tulum and San Cristobal in Mexico. Then when you're working with cities that do have an existing climate strategy, like Ahmedabad in India or Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, the GAP Fund is supporting the turning of these strategies into capital investment programs. So we're advancing towards finance. And then we're supporting cities on specific interventions in specific sectors. So that could be, climate smart urban design guidelines or standards on buildings and energy efficiency that we're doing in 3 Indonesian cities, or solid waste management strategies in 2 cities in Karnataka in India, or the identification of investment opportunities on nature-based solutions in Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Dakar, we're working on the housing sector. So we're looking at providing technical assistance on integrating low carbon and climate resilient considerations in the planning, the development, and the construction of affordable and green housing in Greater Dakar. And with it, there is a pilot green building certification incentive for building developers. We spoke about Bogota and their low carbon vital neighborhoods project, and how to support the city to become the first city in Latin America to pilot that 15-minute city concept. So if you notice, the range of ideas and interventions are wide, but they're all meant to help advance towards the financing that is out there, to prepare bankable projects that could mobilize the investments, that provide the co-benefits, that show how they are sustainable projects that could be financed. So our premise and hence the return to inviting in other development partners and donors and governments to support is there is money out there. It's just we need to advance projects that are bankable to be able to benefit from this type of support. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that clarity. Again, that there is, as we've seen, enormous commitments in terms of finance from financial institutions, as expressed led by Mark Carney in the announcement that we had last week. And the GAP Fund is really a catalyst, as others have said, to get at that larger pool of resources to get the projects underway and accomplished. And Ms. Urrutia, you mentioned earlier challenges for Bogota in getting enough funding from the federal government in Colombia to support all of your needs. In particular, they have a lot of priorities across the landscape of the country. We face the same problem in Canada. Even the wealthiest countries, the cities don't have enough funding from our national governments to take care of the infrastructure and to make sure it's ready for the climate impacts that we're facing. And I'm curious if, with your priorities, do you see that changing in Colombia, or do you think that there's going to be more need for the GAP Fund to scale? Do you have other sources of funding to do this? I don't know of anything else like the GAP Fund, but I'm curious if you have other opportunities, or if you see any hope with your federal government to get a lot more funding so that you can take action on the ground. How does it look for you going forward and in the climate priorities that you have?
So I think things aren't looking bad for us. I think as political will and political attention towards climate change in cities is increasing momentum, we have different allies, different organizations that we can and will work with. I don't want to generalize negatively about the federal government's support. In Colombia, the national government has been very supportive of our agenda to have an energy transition in the transport sector. And we have a very large agenda with the national government in terms of getting up to date with our transport agenda. Bogota, as I mentioned earlier, has over 8 million inhabitants, and yet we don't have a metro line. We've just started work on our first metro line. We're planning to build 5 metro lines over the next 14 to 20 years. It's a huge challenge for the city, but it must get done in order to have the clean transport that our city needs. But with most of the energy focused on transport, which does emit almost half of our emissions, 48% of Bogota's emissions come from the transport sector. So we definitely have to work on that, and yet we still have to work on other issues, such as greening the city and having more and better space for nature in our city. So I think it's a big matter. It's a big question of how much has to get done. There's so many things that we have to do in cities, especially considering climate justice and the way we have to make our most vulnerable segments of the population better adapted to climate change and facing less climate risk over the next century. So I think it's a matter. I don't think there will be a point where we think we're adapted enough. In terms of carbon neutrality, I do think we're going to reach that point in which we think we know we're carbon neutral. For us, it's 2050, as for most cities. But in terms of adaptation, green spaces, quality of life, and the full spectrum of climate adaptation, the work we have to do is really enormous, especially considering, as I mentioned before, that these cities have been informally built, and there's not that much, there hasn't been a lot of planned work, not specifically for the climate emergency, but in general, we have to sort of get our city up to date with tasks that we should have faced. When I speak to Paris 100 years ago, when I speak to other cities, maybe 50 or 40 years ago. So it's looking good for us in terms of we've been able to build our climate action plan, thinking also of how to have stakeholders across the world invest with us and learn with us in terms of how to adapt such a large city with such huge inequality to the challenges of climate change. We are seeing collaboration from the national government. We have seen support from institutions such as the IDB, from WRI, which has been very supportive of our neighborhood work. So I think there will always be gaps that we have to fill, specifically in terms of adapting the most vulnerable segments of our population, and also in terms of identifying what cities have to do in terms of biodiversity and how we can better connect with the challenges of biodiversity and forest loss. But also in terms of just making, the specific surgical interventions at the neighborhood level for adaptation and for improving quality of life and air quality as well. Air quality is a huge issue in Bogota. We have around 2,000 annual deaths related to bad air quality. So these issues, unfortunately, we have solutions that are able to address these challenges jointly. And I think we've been able to identify very good partners to face these challenges. But I do think opportunities such as those that the GAP Fund presents allow us to think collectively, to present proposals, and to have access to finance for issues that are hard to finance at the local level.
No, thank you for that. I think quite optimistic perspective on your adaptation and your work to tackle climate resilience and the many partners that you need to work with on that. Great that hopefully the GAP Fund can continue to be a strong one of those for many cities. And I want to just close with a question to Mr. Malongo. In South Africa, you spoke to the, as Ms. Urrutia said, a sort of surgical approach to dealing with a very difficult situation with managing your water and flooding, and keeping people safe, keeping people alive when there are heavy rains, and making sure the infrastructure is resilient. Would you say, in terms of the process and the partnership, it's been good, it's been straightforward working with the GAP Fund? From your city's perspective, how is our process? How is it for your city to go through this process? You were successful in getting approval and you going forward with your project, but maybe some advice for you to other cities that are watching as they look to seeking funding from the GAP Fund. How would you recommend they take next steps, and how was the process for you?
Thank you so much, Program Director. Like I indicated earlier, that we developed our city climate response strategy and implementation plan, and we have been for quite some time trying to explore different sources of funding that will ensure that we really build a climate resilient city. So in this particular project, the stormwater, it encompasses, it starts from the catchment management point of view. We are having projects that are ensuring that our catchment are being rehabilitated. Those that have been affected are rehabilitated. And it's broadly in terms of also not just stormwater drainage management, it also includes the whole river basin management in a way. And as a city, we have made it part of our practice that almost all of our new projects that we're implementing that are approved by council in terms of our integrated development plan, that we're making sure that from an environmental point of view, all of those projects that are being implemented by the city are climate change compliant projects, and to ensure that we mean business in terms of building a resilient city in terms of climate change. So from our point of view, Program Director, I will indicate that we already had a number of projects. This is just to assist us in terms of ensuring that we have got the proper plans that would be considered for the design stages and implementation stages as a city. But we didn't have the resources for us to come up with the proper designs that we think are going to assist us in addressing the challenge that we are really facing. So much as it has been a competitive kind of a situation, but we're comfortable in the sense that we already had identified quite a number of projects within our climate change and response strategy that are awaiting support, and some of them we are able to implement them internally as a city. As I've indicated, any infrastructure project that we are developing as a city going forward, we are ensuring that all those projects must ensure that they take into consideration climate change management and strategies to ensure that as we transit from these greenhouse gases into a green economy and renewable energies, those are some of the initiatives that are also there as a city. We're not just looking at only stormwater management. It was just one of those within the city space that was quickly and available that we really needed also to consider. But we are working on a large scale from a catchment management point of view to a river management. So, and we are grateful that we have political leadership that is also in support of this initiative, because if we don't have the political support, at times, because these are decision makers, these are people that take the decision in terms of which project needs to be funded, which project needs to be supported. So if you don't have that political support, at times it becomes a bit difficult for some of these projects to get to implementation stage and get the necessary resources allocated to them. So we are moving in that direction and ensuring that we are also involving our communities as much as possible to ensure that this climate change impact starts from a household environment point of view. We've got a number of awareness programs that we do from time to time, the city greening, tree planting, that we're encouraging our communities to make sure that they create their own green environment within a household setup. It's not only to be seen to be driven from a government point of view, but it must be driven from a grassroots point of view. And we're just informing the policy directive so that our communities are directed or assisted in ensuring that they've got a project that are supported and they've got a serious impact in terms of building communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and appreciate your response. A very in-depth response to the projects, the extent of projects that you need, and how to connect the dots between them. And I appreciate your response, and just wanted to give an opportunity to each of you for some closing comments as we wrap things up here in Glasgow. It's the end of the day here in Scotland on Cities Day. There's been a lot of focus on cities, and we're hopeful that that is influencing the national governments as they go through their final hours of deliberation to negotiate the agreements. I wanted to give each of you an opportunity to just make a brief closing statement, what you're hopeful for, what message you would share with the world of cities and the national governments that are watching us. And why don't we start with you, Mr. Schmidt?
Thank you so much. Well, what I take from Glasgow is clearly the real sense of urgency. Everybody has seen that, but also the enormous amount of investment needs we are having in low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure in cities. So clearly the cities will be key for the future. The second point I would like to share is, for me also, the hope that we will be collectively able to build back better and foster green growth in cities, in particular also that we ensure that the transition to a low carbon economy will be done in a just manner, i.e. leaving nobody behind. Last but not least, I think the crucial role of cities and municipalities has been already outlined throughout the Cities Day today, but it is clear that international financial institutions like the World Bank, like the EIB, like many others, are here to help and to continue. So reach out to us, reach out to the government, to the GAP Fund. And also, I would like to join Sameh's thanks to the Luxembourgish and the German government, and would hope that others would join. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Schmidt. And Mr. Waba, closing comments from you?
So I have one comment. I mean, we have a task of such enormous magnitude ahead. And if we are going to rely on concessional funding, official development assistance as being the major source of financing, we're totally missing the boat. So we have to focus on unleashing other financing sources that are out there. One is, the support to cities, which are a central part of the solution on, improving their own source revenues, on scaling up the funding that they utilize, things like land value capture, etc. A second is definitely we need to unleash private investment. And I think, the opportunity of, attracting private lenders, private investors to invest in resilient and climate smart infrastructure, especially in the places that are fastest urbanizing, is going to become central. However, to attract the private lenders and investors into places that have little track record in terms of creditworthiness, lack of information, etc., will require credit enhancement, will require de-risking such capital, with guarantees, etc. So it is important to start thinking about what could be done in terms of public-private partnerships to attract the private sector. And then lastly, thinking about investment incentives for households to be able also to invest, to change behavior, etc. And Werner spoke about the Build Back Better. Let me talk about one of our programs about Build Better Before, on helping to improve, building codes, helping to improve, the way the built environment is being constructed, and providing the incentives for households to be able to invest both in improving the resilience of, let's say, their housing stock, but also ensuring that it is a greener sets of buildings. So being able to unleash these other financing sources is going to be a very, very important complement. And of course, the centrality of the role of the GAP Fund, which is to create those opportunities, to create that pipeline of investment projects and those new ideas about how to unleash more investment, is going to remain very much centered. So joining Werner into inviting other donors to come and join the governments of Germany and Luxembourg who have led the path in there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Waba. And Ms. Urrutia, a final word from Bogota.
So I think my main takeaway from Glasgow is precisely how cities are increasing their presence and their relevance in the climate discussion. I think both the Global Covenant, C40, and many other city organizations have helped to make the relevance of city issues very visible at Glasgow. And with events such as this one and processes such as the Global Gap Fund, we've seen response to that. So it's been feeding into each other. The relevance of cities, the way investments from all actors can actually be more effective in cities than in other spaces, really has been something that I've seen a lot of discussion at the COP. And I think it's a very encouraging message for all of us who are working on city issues. And I think the way we find different sources of financing for different activities has really been underscored by this event and by this fund. The way there are the innovation and the way city thinking and proposals from cities driven by city needs is really one of the things that I think have been most relevant from these discussions. So I come away very optimistic in terms of interventions in cities and finance in cities coming through for huge effect, not only on cities and mitigation and emissions, but really on the places where most of the people in the world live. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for your closing thoughts, and over to you, Mr. Malongo from Mbombela, South Africa. Any closing thoughts that you wish to share?
Thank you so much once more, Program Director. We have appreciated the CAP fund that we have received. But from my side, maybe what we would like to see as a city is more sharing of knowledge and experience, particularly from countries that are of similar nature in terms of our economies, and also issues of capacity building, because any of these our climate response strategy relies heavily or depends on the necessary capacity to be able to manage operation and maintenance, because once they've built that infrastructure, they still have to have the necessary capacity to be able to manage it so that it's sustainable. So we're looking forward to more support towards capacity building and networking. As the GIZ is a network of different cities, if they can bring us together for knowledge sharing, so that we will learn from each other and we are able to quickly apply certain principles that are being applied that we're not aware of, and also the issues of building capacity amongst ourselves, and so that we are able to sustain whatever initiative that we are putting around community resilient towards climate change. And yeah, as a city, we are more our competitive advantage is more on agriculture. So different ways of implementing planting of crops and citrus farming, so that we don't lose that particular economy due to this dry season or heat wave that we're experiencing. So there are different practices that we can learn from each other. In the main, it's learning from each other, networking, and capacity building. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your words. Very great wisdom from the front lines in our cities, from you two in Bogota and Mbombela. So I think maybe just first of all to thank all of you, our esteemed panelists, for sharing your stories, all of the work that you are doing with and for the GAP Fund in helping to make sure that these resources get to cities where they're needed the most and help the people who need that the most. I think we've seen excellent success so far. I just want to speak on behalf of the Global Covenant of Mayors, which is the largest alliance of mayors around the world. It's now 11,700 plus mayors in cities around the world who are committed to climate action. It's a remarkable scale now around the world, where we see leadership. Over 80% of our cities have climate action plans, and we're seeing implementation now. The challenge is, and has been illustrated by our panelists here, is there needs to be more finance. Frankly, we need more funding from either our own domestic governments where they can do that, but also from the international community. There needs to be more funding getting to cities to address the needs where they are the greatest. That finance piece has been front and center today for cities on Cities Day, trying to influence the Conference of the Parties here in Glasgow. But the collaboration piece is critical, and that is a huge strength of the GAP Fund, is bringing the capacity of the World Bank and the European Investment Bank in terms of a process, bringing resources so far from Germany and Luxembourg, but the capacity that exists in all of our cities to share knowledge and technical assistance, all of the networks that are supporting this work on the ground, not only from the GAP Fund stage with pre-feasibility studies, but then getting the projects built, which in our cities is a win-win. We create jobs to build these projects, and we get a positive outcome for our cities. I think the big challenge, though, back to finance, is only 7% of the green recovery funding is made it to cities. A very small percentage of what we've been talking about since the pandemic started, the importance of channeling that funding into building back better, or as I think a very wise way to put it, building better before, making sure we build the right green infrastructure now, particularly in these cities like Bogota and Mambella that are growing so fast and have great needs for that infrastructure. So we need to see a bigger share of that pie on green recovery going to cities. We're making lots of noise about that here in Glasgow as cities and around the world, and all of our 4 panelists have made, I think, excellent interventions about the importance of what the GAP Fund is delivering from the finance side right down to the difference it makes to people on the ground. So honored to be speaking with all of you today, telling the story and the successes of our GAP Fund, and encouraging our national governments to contribute, to put more on the table that we can get to the cities around the world, particularly in the global south, that need that support the most to deal with climate impacts and make sure we build a fair and just and healthy world going forward. So on behalf of Global Covenant of Mayors and all of our partners here at the GAP Fund, a big thanks to all of you for tuning in, and we look forward to sharing more positive stories in the future, working together. Thank you.